guest today. We have Christin Bentley, who was missing last week. We're very glad to have you back. We have Monica Cline from It Takes a Family, and we have Lee Spiller from every time I go to say it, it's like I get tongue-tied. Tell me again.
Lee Spiller from Citizens Commission on Human Rights, Texas.
I'm going to have to write it and put it on my computer because I know it until I open my mouth, and then I think I'm going to say something wrong. So thank you for having my back. So I'm excited. There's a lot going on in Texas as it relates to public education. There's a lot going on as it relates to legislation. But let's talk about just what are you hearing in public education in Texas this last week?
Who wants to start?
I know it was not a boring week.
No, it wasn't.
Well, what I'm hearing a lot of, which we talk about this a lot.
Monica, we are not 911.
Oh, am I muted? Can you hear me?
Christin, can you hear her?
I can hear
her.
Okay.
Okay. Obviously, we're hearing a lot and seeing a lot about mental health in bills and in the schools and so many programs. And it's hard because in the work that we all do, especially Lee, but all of us and many parents across the nation, there's this dissonance between what kids really need and what the school is attempting to provide when it comes to mental health. And then there's this, on the other hand, sometimes I think, well, our schools are for academics. They're not places of counseling. And so when I hear teachers are burdened by all of this, I think, well, we can make that easy. Of course, you're burdened. It's not your role to provide counseling or mindfulness or social emotional learning or any of those things. Of course, you're overwhelmed because that's not what you were trained for. It's not your profession. It's not why you entered the profession. At the same time, I also don't believe it even belongs in the school at all. If it meant hiring counselors, I think it's really undermining the authority of parents when our government is inserting various types of counselors into our schools to assess and counsel our children informally or even formally. And so it's such a web, and obviously I'm just going to stop talking so I can hear from the rest of you, but that's what I've been hearing a lot of is counseling. But in addition to counseling, it sounds a lot like re-education. So it's not just let me hear about your feelings, but it's also if you don't align with this ideological belief about race or gender or sex or guns or whatever, then now these counselors and the schools are trying to re-educate both teachers and children. So it sounds more like a re-education camp than it actually sounds like truly caring for the feelings of our kids.
I'd like to just add that, what teachers were trained to do for decades was classroom management. And so classroom management is just it's a really important part of teaching, and but what it doesn't include is therapy, and it never included that. And I know that we've talked about this a lot, and not everybody knows who's probably watching that I have a credential. A teaching credential and a master's in special education, and my area of expertise is in special education. And so what we do know is that if you have a student who is struggling to learn because of their behavior, and it's outside of what we would call the needs of a typical student who can thrive and learn and make academic gains through regular classroom management, that would be a student who would very likely qualify for special education. And so instead, it seems like what they're trying to do is provide this broad intensive therapy for all students, and whether they need it or not. And it definitely is starting to look a lot like re-education camps. And I think when we look at how radicalized all of the universities have become who are producing teachers and new teachers, how radicalized all of their unions are, all of their teacher associations are. I mean, we just had the NTA, I believe, came out this week and said that children should, or students should, start learning about pronouns in preschool. That just tells you how radicalized education has become. And so now we're seeing it in our public elementary schools and middle schools and high schools. And it's definitely crossing the line of what schools were meant to do and meant to be.
That's right. Traditionally, with education, when you did have children with disabilities or who had a need, schools were providing something, but it was incidental to education. You know, the whole focus was to get them an education. And what we're seeing now is universal services. And I know the Texas Association of School Boards has taken a position that some of the things that we normally think would require parental consent, like mental health screening, they're saying there's no specific consent for that. And that's dangerous. Some of these screeners are the same things that are being used in doctors' offices. So how are they not a test?
Yeah.
Well, and what I'm seeing as well is that even, that many of these kids are receiving this
kind of a
information.
random
Oh, go
conversation
ahead.
and subject of schools came up into homeschool 2 of their 3. The reason is because the environment of the school values are not and the one wanted to stay for sport background, and they stayed on top of it. That scary for him, actually, to leave in public school. And as I left, and I was thinking about like his belief he's built his family on are literally when he sends his kid to school. Wow, there that parents across the state, and then I think there are some parents that are exactly what's happened.
Yeah, Melissa, you're breaking up. We can't hear everything you're saying.
That's weird.
Just you may have to put on some. You may have to put
I'm
on
going
some
to disappear
headphones.
and back.
Okay. So the other thing that happened this week, and it reminds me of schools, is there was a Psychology Today article on countering the mental health misinformation on TikTok. And one of the, it starts with the problem of all of a sudden they're getting kids who are having normal life problems, but they identify as mentally ill. And then it turns out there's all this mental health content. It's being accessed by kids who are underage, who are, just because of being a kid, undergoing changes. And so the mental health problem becomes the answer to, gosh, why am I insecure about my body? Or why am I insecure about this or that? And it turned out that there were industry people who were funding, like you take the big influencers, the big content creators that are popular, and all of a sudden you've got industry people funding that message. Right.
Yeah. I think it's crazy. I mean, really what we're seeing is this, like kids can no longer go through normal adolescence. No. And I think we can all relate as adults who can look back and kind of remember what adolescence was like, and that transition from, being prepubescent into a pubescent teenager. It's very uncomfortable. And then we have, depending on the personality and circumstances of the child, some kids go through it a little bit more easily than others, but it's very normal for kids to go and want to be in their bedroom a lot. And it's very normal for them to just start crying all of a sudden over something that seems very small to us as parents, but they have big emotions during that time. These are all things that are just completely typical and what, typical child development through puberty. And now we're treating them as though they're mentally ill for for going through the normal or having normal symptoms of what puberty is. And really, as parents, I think it's important for us to understand what's what it looks like for a child to go through puberty, because otherwise, Lee, I think you would agree, it meets a lot of it just would meet the criteria of in an adult mental illness, perhaps.
Yeah, and we're teaching kids to identify that way. The health textbooks for high school and middle school are full of really scary messaging around what to me looks like pretty normal emotions, but you should seek professional help. And untreated mental illness, if you don't get treated, you could end up homeless or criminal justice involved or whatever. That's really a dirty trick. And to me, it smacks of marketing.
Absolutely. I know that in Goodhart Wilcox, they had a paragraph about anxiety disorder, and then they had the photo or the kind of cartoon image that they had next to the description of anxiety disorder, or it might have been like social anxiety disorder, were all these kids sitting on a bench, like they were athletes. One was dressed up in a football jersey, another, so it was various athletes sitting on a bench. And the description was that, when you feel nervous or you're afraid of how you'll perform or what other people will think of you, that would be an anxiety disorder. Well, that's just normal feelings, and we all felt that way when we're playing sports, or if you're in theater, or anytime you're performing. And and like Christin said, just as a teen walking down the hall, you're self-conscious. That's just a normal thing.
Look how many
said, we're transitioning. So what we're seeing is these health textbooks and this whole approach through our government education, for whatever reason, is trying to diagnose an issue with normal behavior, normal development. And what it's doing is also creating a mental health issue with our kids. And so where it was a normal thing, now they're being told it's not normal. So now all of a sudden they do believe they have a mental health issue. And so now all of a sudden the school's mental health services are the fix. So it's almost like they're creating the problem and then saying, look, now we have a fix. It's very frustrating to see this. And I don't know if y'all remember on the Mind Polluters, Carol Ayala, who she was a elementary school teacher for many, many years, got awards, families loved her. She was an exceptional teacher. And she mentioned that when you introduce things like what Christin said about pronouns and telling kids that they may not be the gender that they actually are, or they start introducing things about sex to children, she said that their reaction to anything that they don't understand or that creates this cognitive dissonance in them, that they would just cry. That they would just start crying.
Yeah.
So now all of a sudden, because the schools are introducing all these things to the kids and the kids start crying, they're like, see, our children have mental health issues and now we have to provide them with a fix. But they're creating the problem. They're abusing our children with our tax money and with the approval of our government.
Yep.
Yeah, there's that vicious cycle that I think we see a lot of, where they create a problem and then they have the solution to the problem. And then it's this cycle of, well, who benefits from creating the problems and the solutions? Well, there's money involved in that, a lot of money involved in that. But, with regard to Carol, I remember that part of the film very well. And what we know about children and their development is it's very typical for children to be very, when they're in that stage of development in the toddler, preschool, and going into preschool years, especially, they're very into, like, their identity is very much about I'm a boy, I'm a girl, and then to tell them that they can choose if they're a boy or a girl, or they may not be a boy, they
Right.
could be a girl. It becomes it's messing with their reality and their actual typical development. So you're taking what is gender dysphoria, which there are children who have or display, signs of gender dysphoria. And instead of meeting the needs of the child with gender dysphoria, you're confusing all the kids who don't have gender dysphoria and upsetting their reality and upsetting them mentally and developmentally. And so it definitely creates a problem for other kids. And then we see later in development, we see, that same type of confusion, I think, there's a peer pressure that then develops more in that, in that pubescent period. And that's why we see, like, in one classroom, 7, fifth graders who all of a sudden identify as transgender all at once. And we see stories like that. But yeah, it's just,
that almost sounds like the phenomenon of cutting, where one kid starts cutting and then other kids see it. So, like my organization doesn't get into the gender issues because, frankly, we're just as likely to help, a gay person or whoever who's being abused in a mental health setting as anybody else, right? But what you're bringing up just is really a good point. I mean, the way we're doing our education, it's almost like you could point this type of education at anything. And right now they're pointing it at gender, but it could just as easily be pointed at your political views, your religious views. These are young children. These are their minds. And parents really need to keep an eye on who's trying to manipulate them.
And if we switch over a little bit to parental rights, and a lot of, everything we're talking about here goes into the whole parental rights realm. Where does the line for school stop and where does the line for parents continue? Because the line for parents doesn't stop when my child goes into the school. And that's basically what's happening here is they're basically saying, as long as your child is in a public education system, school, activity for that matter, then the parental beliefs don't matter. It's the government that matters. And, at the beginning of the conversation, I think Monica and Christin both mentioned concentration camps, or not concentration camps. What do you call it? Re-education camps. And that's exactly what is happening in our schools. And if we don't recognize that is what they're doing, we are already headed in a direction where our entire next several generations have been fully re-educated right underneath our noses. And I was sent this yesterday, and I thought it was interesting. I don't know how it's interesting how people hang on to things. This is from 1954. It's a kindergarten report card, and it talks about things like, do I know my colors? Yes or no? Do I know my right hand versus my left hand? And it goes through and it has about 20 things that they're asking about. And they're very basic. Can I color? Can I paint? And then at the bottom, it has personal habits. And so this would be the stuff that you might argue is outside of the basic academic education. And this is what it looked like back in 1954. I came to school clean. I keep my fingernails clean. I can take off and put on my coat. I know where to hang up my coat correctly. I am polite. I take turns. Those are the kinds of things that should be happening in kindergarten, not conversations about gender and pronouns and sex. And we have just absolutely lost our minds. From an education standpoint, I would love to see us literally rewind back to this 1954, back to where we have no standardized tests. We are just focused on educating the child and doing what is, I know as Christin would say, developmentally appropriate and what makes sense inside of a classroom, not what honestly just doesn't make sense in a lot of situations.
Well, it's so interesting. So Monica was bringing up how the government, creates problems and then there's another problem that comes about and then there's a solution right away. So I would love to see kindergarten look more like what we had as kids and what our parents had as kids. I would love for preschool to look more appropriate developmentally, because what we know as professionals is that preschoolers need play. They need play-based education. What works well for kindergarten is a lot of play, still a lot of play. And what you're talking about from a 1954 those are child development. Those are certain skills that children need when should develop around 5 years old, being able to put their coat on by themselves, these things that create independence. And those things create confidence in children. And instead, what we've done in the last, I would say 10, probably 20 years in education, probably 20 years now, is that we push academics on 3-year-olds. Starting at 3 years old, we push academics. And instead of developing and nurturing what's developmentally appropriate and building competency and all these things that they need to know before they start learning academics, we've completely bypassed it. And so then we have all these children who don't know how to regulate themselves well in a classroom, who can't sit still, who have anxiety, because children are behaving a lot differently than we did when we were kids. And so then what do? They need it with social emotional learning. Instead of just allowing kids to develop through play and having really good developmentally appropriate programs in preschool and kindergarten, they've created this problem by not offering those programs anymore. And then they are meeting it now with social emotional learning, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense. And, for thousands of years, depended on manners, morals, etiquette, discipline. Now discipline's sketchy, morals, who knows, manners, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very old school here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about parenting, just a tiny bit. But when you talk about self-regulation, I don't expect a school or a preschool to teach my child to self-regulate. That is my responsibility as a parent.
Yep.
And I'm about to get a bunch of parents getting mad at me right now. Children will never learn how to self-relegate if you give them an iPad.
For sure.
And my mom always says that she feels like, that she raised my brother and I like in military school, but we were raised that if we were at a table with adults, like let's say at a restaurant, it was adult time. It wasn't time for kids to run around. It wasn't time for kids to interrupt unless we had to go to the bathroom. We learned to self-relegate because we had expectations. We understood there was a hierarchy and that adults had adults conversations and kids had kid conversations, and they didn't interrupt. And we self-regulated. I grew up that every Saturday, my mom took my grandma out all day long to the mall, to a window shop. And then we'd sit down at a cafe and have pie and coffee while they chatted. And I just sat there and waited, and I was bored, but I did not misbehave. I did not run around. I didn't have an iPad. Obviously not back then. My point is that as human children, we really can self-regulate if our parents help us to do that. And so if your kids are not self-regulating on their own and you're not helping them self-regulate, then of course it's going to get crazy when they're at school.
Yep.
And so I'm not trying to be hard on parents, but at the same time, there are things that we need to be doing at home that help children to self-regulate without technology.
That's
but
right.
Also, I would just, that's so spot on and true. But also what you probably had too, Monica, when you were little, were you allowed to play outside a lot?
I did. And I lived in the country and I played outside a lot. Yes.
Okay. So
Yeah.
One of the things that we have completely interfered with typical child development when we stopped allowing children to play naturally outside with other kids. So when we were growing up, we can remember that we went outside. And if we lived in the country, it looked a little bit differently than maybe if we lived in a neighborhood, but we played outside by ourselves with other kids. And we didn't have parents always interfering with our play. And I kind of hate to use the word interfering, but I mean like when you have play dates inside a home, because that's what's been really big with my kids' generation is these very organized kind of play where there's all these moms who are, no, Johnny, don't take that toy away. Go apologize. Go do this. Go do that. Well, that's very different than what we all grew up with. We grew up being able to play outside, starting even at like 2-3 years old. And what that does in children is they get messages from their peers that they shouldn't act a certain way. They get corrected by other adults in the neighborhood. And so they have to learn to take direction from other adults. So they're learning in their natural environment. They might make mistakes, but they're able to learn and correct, and it builds competency in them. It builds all these things. They build so many things through just unorganized natural play in a natural environment with other kids. And so then you got that as a child. So then, and you didn't have the devices to babysit you. And so then when your mom took you into these situations where you had to sit there and be bored, you were able to do it, and your mom, your mom was able to have the skills to make you do it too. She wasn't going to pacify you, I guess. But
Right. And I think another, piece of that is that being bored, and I was a single mom, and I would let my son know, if he said he was bored, I'm like, well, this is a great opportunity for imagination. So he got to be really creative because I allowed him to be bored enough to invent something, create something, use imagination, create a fort, play on the floor with him. And so we had a really great time being imaginative. And a lot of times I think, I was raised that way because we were, poor. We didn't have cable. We didn't have video games, even when they first came out. But I appreciate it. And I also realized from that experience that there is very little that we need. If all these things disappeared, we actually will do very well. Those things are not necessary. They're not a need. What children need are a mother and a father. What children need is food and shelter. What children need is the love of their parents and support, and to be, for them to discipline them and watch them and protect them. They don't need technology. They don't need the next movie. They don't need constant stimulation. If anything, that will cause a lot of issues when they're constantly viewing something nonstop and they're not actually learning. They're not being creative. They're not using certain parts of their brain because they're constantly being stimulated. And so I think we're going to see a lot more the children actually becoming healthier when we remove a lot of those things from them and allow them to develop almost naturally under the supervision of their parents, of course.
Yeah, this is awesome. I wish we could just keep talking forever. But we are coming to the end of our half hour. I would like to just real quickly, and this is literally just needs to be a shout out, no explanation. If you would like to give a shout out or a pat on the back to a legislator who maybe filed a bill that you're really happy about, let's maybe do that right now before we close up.
Okay. Ooh, good.
Shout out to Representative Swanson, Representative Hull, Representative Click, Representative Senator Hall.
Okay.
I'd like to shout out to Senator Middleton and to Representative Patterson for multiple things, and then to Representative Terry Leo Wilson as well.
Awesome.
So I'd like to give a shout out to Patterson for HB 1655. Were we allowed to say the bill number?
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot that I guess I could give a shout out to that y'all have already mentioned. Senator Hughes, he's my state senator, and he just filed a companion bill for the drag shows to prevent kids from going into drag shows. So shout out to him.
I'm just going to ditto everybody on this. And as far as the drag shows, we saw some great things coming out of Florida about that as well. I know we've had similar discussions here in Texas about using TABC or the, alcohol regulation to help in some of these issues with children being exposed to adult entertainment in bars and places where there's drag shows basically and strip teases. So we had those discussions in Texas. We're seeing it happening in Florida, and it seems to be working. So, shout out to all the legislators who are helping with ending the sexualization of children.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
And Nate Schatzlane is another one. Sorry.
Yes, I would agree.
And Matt
with that.
Shaking.
Yes, yeah, we really could keep shouting out lots of different names, and we definitely don't want to leave anybody out. There's a lot of really great things happening in Austin, and we're so appreciative of the legislators actually listening to what is going on in education. And now we just need to make sure that the solutions that are being brought to the table are tweaked enough to where we have as much protection as possible for parental rights and the safety of our kids. So it's time to go, and sorry about the technical difficulties earlier. We're still learning and growing here, but thank you everybody who participated. Summer, I see you're back, and we even have someone here from Argentina, and just thank you so much. I know the video last week was shared a lot, and we really appreciate everybody tuning in, and we will be back next week.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye everybody.